Hi, everybody. This is Brian from Attendance Bias, and I'd like to welcome you to the last, for now, classic episode of the podcast as I took my break during the month of January, and I'm ready to come back next week, the second week of February, with a whole bunch of new, exciting, fun episodes. For this last classic episode of Attendance Bias, I'd like to present one of what I consider to be the best deep dives into early-ish Phish history. And today's interview was with Sue Drew, who worked A&R for Elektra Records in the early 90s, and therefore she was the person who signed Phish to Elektra. And as I mentioned in the proper episode intro, I love Phish's music, of course, but I'm also a history buff, and when I'm able to combine those two interests, well, there's nothing better. So in this interview, I reach out usually to fans and pretty much anyone who wants to talk and geek out about Phish, but it's rare that I'm actually able to get someone who is involved with the business side of Phish. As we all know, they're pretty secretive about that part. So to hear from someone who is a first-person point of view, a primary source, so to speak, and tell us what it was like to know the band at that time when Trey himself was only 26, when they were growing exponentially and beginning their takeover of the world, or at least mid-sized venues, I was thrilled that Sue agreed to speak to me not only about her role in Phish's professional history, but also about a really classic show, December 28th, 1990, at the Marquee in New York City, a venue which no longer exists. So if you're into old school Phish, if you're into young Phish, and if you're into hearing a little bit of a peek behind the curtain about Phish's history, enjoy today's classic episode from Sue Drew, A&R person for Elektra Records, who signed Phish to the record label. Talk about December 28th, 1990, and I'm so excited to see you next week for brand new episodes and for several months after that. Enjoy. Hi, everybody, and welcome to today's episode of Attendance Bias. I am your host, Brian Weinstein. Now, I have to be honest, I love every single episode of Attendance Bias. I'm proud of every episode, and I'm grateful to every single guest who's willing to come on to the show and talk about a favorite jam or a favorite show of theirs. That said, I also have to tell you that just like all of you, my interest of Phish goes beyond the music and extends into their history, the mythology of the band's upcoming, their behind-the-scenes action and their business, and everything involved with whatever happened to bring them to the band known as Phish that we know and love today. So an episode like today, where I get to interview a person who is absolutely crucial in their development, not only as a musical group, but as a force to be reckoned with within the music industry, really makes me come away glowing. And that interview today is with music industry legend Sue Drew of Cobalt Music Publishing. Not only does she work now at Cobalt Music Publishing, but for a time in the late 80s or early 90s, she worked at Elektra Records. And during that time, she stumbled across a young foursome that was playing in New York City at the time, known as Phish. And you'll hear more about it later. I don't want to spoil the details, but Sue Drew, long story short, is the person who signed Phish to Elektra Records. Even more importantly, Sue not only talks about the business side of her relationship with Phish, but it's very clear throughout her discussion that she is a fan, dyed-in-the-wool of the band and their music. For today's episode, Sue decided to speak about December 28th, 1990 at a small venue that no longer exists in New York City called the Marquee. This is the first time that Sue ever saw Phish, and even more exciting, and I'll leave it to the episode to tell you, what inspired her to approach them to sign them to Elektra. So that's enough from me. I just want to get to the episode as quickly as possible. Let's listen to my interview with superfan Sue Drew of Cobalt Recordings about December 28th, 1990 at the Marquee in New York City.
Let's meet today's guest.
Sue Drew of Cobalt Music Publishing, thank you so much for joining me today on Attendance Bias.
It is my pleasure, Brian. Very exciting to be here.
I'm also excited to have you here because of the episodes that we've had so far. Everyone's excited to talk about Phish and a special moment that they've had, but you certainly fill a unique role in their history in that you were at a major turning point for Phish when they signed with Elektra Records. And I think that Phish, as a business, as a band, but also as a business, is very secretive about what goes on behind the scenes. All of Phish is an inside joke. And for fans, we just see the tip of the iceberg, what happens on stage. And you kind of saw a little bit under the water with that. You saw a little bit under the iceberg. And I can't wait to hear your side of that story way back in 1990. Before we get to it, though, you're the general manager of creative at Cobalt Music Publishing. For people who don't know much about the music business, what is your day-to-day? What do you actually do?
So as the GM creative at Cobalt, a position I've had for 8 years now, my role is to oversee the US creative team. And the creative team is much like an A&R team at a record label. We're the people that sign the songwriters, and some of the time they're artists as well. So we sign the artists and writers, and we work creatively with them. If they want collaborations with other artists and writers, we put them in sessions. If they've written songs that they'd like pitched to other artists, we pitch those songs. It's just general creative and helping somebody further their career while they're at Cobalt.
So you would work, let's say, with Bernie Taupin more than Elton John in a situation like that?
Well, Elton is equal songwriter. He writes the music, Bernie writes the lyrics. I don't care who writes what. And as long as it's a song that comes out at the end, we want to work with the songwriters. So, yeah, what I'm saying is that some artists actually write their own songs and some do not. If it's an artist that doesn't write their song, they would not have a publishing deal, because publishing only deals with the songwriting aspect of somebody's career. So we have many artists that are signed to us, from people in Fleetwood Mac to the Foo Fighters to, Gwen Stefani, but they write their own songs, which is why they're signed to us. We wouldn't sign somebody like Barbra Streisand. She's not a songwriter.
Right. And before that, you worked A&R, right?
Yes, for many, many years. I started in A&R in 1986. I was an assistant in an A&R department at Polygram Records in New York. And I there found my first artist that I brought to the label, a woman named Michelle Schacht. And we signed Michelle. And then I got promoted to a junior A&R person. And then I left Polygram about a year later and went to Elektra, which is where I signed They Might Be Giants and then Phish in 1991. And then after that, I went to Warner Brothers. And I've been around quite a while. And done a lot of things.
The only time I heard, or the first time I heard the phrase A&R, I didn't even know it was two letters. I didn't know it was an acronym. I thought it was A&R.
Yeah,
I thought it was a single word.
What it meant either.
Yeah, I heard it. I remember from the Tom Petty song "Into the Great Wide Open," which is, for anyone who doesn't know it, is about an up and coming singer, and they record an album, him and his girlfriend, and the narrator Tom Petty says their A&R man says, "I don't hear a single."
Yep.
So my understanding, again, and please correct me if I'm wrong, is that an A&R person's job is to promote. Is it to make their music more palatable to a wider audience?
Well, not exactly. What A&R stands for is artist and repertoire. And so it's an old school term that really existed before artists wrote their own material. So the A&R man would find songs to then send to his artist to record. But really what it means today is discovering the talent, signing the talent to the record company, or in my case, if it's a publishing situation, and then being the internal cheerleader for that artist within the record company. For me, I gravitated towards artists that had a clear vision. They knew who they were. They weren't looking for my help in discovering themselves. They had been discovered internally. And so my role was really just to help them acclimate to being signed to a label and then help them release their music out into the world.
So like a liaison between an artist and the record company?
Yeah. I mean, you work for the record company, but really every A&R person feels that they work for the artist. It's just the natural way because you're so hoping that the world will discover this artist as you have and feel as passionately about them as you do. So, but yeah, you're employed by the label. So sometimes there's conflicts.
Well, I'm really excited to dig into that quite a bit because I think Phish fans all have a sense of ownership because of their discovery of the band. And Phish has flirted with mainstream success. They never, in my opinion, quite got there. And that's not a failure in their case. They're probably the most successful touring band that, doesn't really care about recorded music in a studio, at least. They've never reached widespread fame. When you mentioned other bands that you've worked with, I don't know. I feel like that would put you in a difficult position for a band that doesn't really want to be, maybe not want to be, but a band who's not that interested in pleasing a record company.
Yes. It was difficult. It was difficult on both sides of it. Firstly, it was difficult to convince the band to sign to a major label because it's not really something they were aspiring to. They didn't really care. They were going to do what they were going to do. They didn't want the specter of this label hanging over them, trying to turn them into something that they weren't. And it's also difficult to bring an artist into a label if you don't think there's commercial potential. But artistic direction and commercial potential can work hand in hand. And just because Phish didn't want to play the label game doesn't mean they didn't have potential to sell records. And I think that's what was the most exciting to me. It's that they were 100% unique and focused on their path, but I felt that it would be something that many, many people would respond to. So
yeah, and we're going to get into that for sure. But I agree with you. There are artists just off the top of my head, like Tom Waits, for example, or Warren Zevon, who are only true to themselves. And yet they do have very large followings and have both reached a degree of commercial success.
Absolutely. Two of my very favorite artists, as a matter of fact. And for Warren Zevon in particular, he was an excellent songwriter and other people covered his songs. But he wasn't going to play any games, I don't know if Phish looked at it harshly, like, oh, we don't want to be part of this, infrastructure of big multinational corporation. I don't know how much they thought about that part of it. I think they really just thought, we don't really need this.
Yeah, I mean, my guess, from what I've read, it seems that there's a big part of Phish, and I truly believe this, because they grew up in the 70s when album rock was, the pinnacle of commercial success. I think that making an album is so important to them because, to be honest, they never have to make another album again for the rest of their professional lives. They could retire multimillionaires without laying down another studio recording. But I think that whether it's Trey or Page, any one of them thinks that there's something to getting a gold record. I think they see it like it's in their DNA as humans and as music fans.
They have a gold record, a live one.
Yes.
Maybe the others have too by now, but that went gold kind of right away. But yeah, I think that's true. And I've said this before in another interview. The thing that ultimately I think attracted them to signing to Elektra Records was when I had them up to our office, which was in Rockefeller Plaza and very, decorated up to the nines as a record label was trying to look cool. And we were cool, actually, for label.
Elektra's always been cool. I
opened the CD cabinet, which was this cabinet where we had, most of the CDs from artists that had been on Elektra Records through the years. And when you open that cabinet and you see this incredible bounty of talent, I think they went, oh, yeah, we want to be part of that lineage because, it's just an amazing group of talented people in all genres. And as you say, album artists, because
Yeah.
electro really became, I think, really came into its own during that era.
Well, I remember when I read a biography about the Doors,
Mhm.
and I think the first music billboard that was taken out in Hollywood was for their first album, the Doors' first album. That it was the four of them, their faces, like a familiar picture, and it said "Break on through" with an electrifying new album.
Yeah.
And I think I was only 12 years old when I read that book. I was getting into my classic rock phase, and it was the first time I really fused together a record label with a personality. To me, it could have been any record label produced any artist. It didn't matter to me. It was just music. But I think that surprised me. I remember in my young adolescence that there was a label that tried to make a personality for itself for the consumer.
It did, and it succeeded, and it continued to do that. And I would say that, we would have many meetings internally where the chairman would say, people buy Elektra records. They trust in the brand of Elektra. If they see that E on a record, then they're gonna take a chance on it and buy it. And I think that's true. It was a artistic aesthetic, not single lane, not single minded, but you knew it was going to be quality. That was important for me working there. Like I wanted to be associated with a label that was quality.
You want to be cool, right? They're the cool band. They're the cool label.
I came from Polygram previously to that. It's like, that's not very cool. Let me go to Elektra.
Well, I remember when I would also get Zeppelin albums, that Atlantic, like that was very, very much, you could tell, oh, that's an Atlantic record because it looks like my Led Zeppelin records.
Yeah, totally. Those logos were very meaningful.
So how did you first get into Phish? How did they first get on your radar?
So when I was a young A&R person, I subscribed to the CMJ, which was College Music Journal.
Sure.
And it was an actual journal, long page journal. And I saw on the cover one week a picture of Lawn Boy. And they would put 4 album covers each week. And a lot of times I would then go down to Tower Records and I would buy the records that were on the cover of CMJ. Things moved way more slowly in those days because we didn't have social media. Nothing was immediate. It just, you took your time. So I would go to Tower probably every week. I would buy records. I would listen to them. So I bought Lawn Boy and I put it on, and it was the most extraordinarily odd record I had heard, maybe ever. I don't know. It could have been ever. I have a classical music background, and I have a lot of tolerance for a lot of stuff. But I thought, well, there's something about this. It's really interesting. I don't know what it is, but it's interesting.
You grew up in Southern California, right? When you talk about having a big musical background.
Yeah, well, I grew up in Central California, but I went to college in LA, and then I moved to New York after college. But I didn't ever really love the Southern California. I appreciated the Eagles and Jackson Browne and Linda Ronstadt, but they were not my thing per se. I was way more into punk and new wave, and I wasn't really into the California sound, probably because I was from there. But I kept coming back to Lawn Boy. Like every few days I'd put it on and I'd listen to it. And then I kept seeing in the Village Voice that Phish was playing the Wetlands, which was a pretty hippy dippy club down, in the Tribeca area.
It wasn't until the day it closed. It had that reputation. And it wasn't just a venue. It was like an activist center also.
It was. Yeah, it really was. And I remember not being able to make any of those shows. There were like 3 or 4 that I saw they had played that I couldn't get to. And then I saw they were playing a venue called the Marquee, which didn't have a long life in New York. Although there is a Marquee here now, not far from where.
Yeah, it's not the same one. I did a lot of research in preparation for this interview, and the Marquee that we're going to talk about today, I had to do some some deep digging to find anything out about it because of what you said, because there's a current day Marquee on, I think, the Upper West Side or the Upper East Side. It's not the same.
It isn't the same. I walked past it the other day. But anyway, so I decided I was going to go see them at the Marquee. And I don't know, I really don't remember if I had reached out or not to management. There might have been a phone number or something to call. I don't know if I did or I didn't. But I walked up to the Marquee and the scene outside was really different. I was used to going to CBGBs and seeing bands that were just kind of to the point bang, And I go to the Marquee and there's people milling about and they're all kind of, they're all of a college age and they're all kind of just a little out of it. And I'm like, well, this is interesting.
Very little has changed in some ways, by the way.
It hasn't. I know, which I love, actually. So I remember opening the door. I think there was like a curtain or something. And then I went inside of the club and I could not believe my eyes. I could not believe this audience. The band either had just come on or was just shortly to come on. And I looked around this room and I thought, wow, I'm not in this world. Who are these people? How do they know about this? How are they already so enthusiastic about this band that I really didn't know anything about? And what struck me, though, I think a lot of people might go, oh, look at this. There's like 1,000 people here and they're all excited. Let's jump on this artist and sign them. And I would never do that because I would have to love what I was working on. It's too difficult to sign an artist and not love them. But once they started playing and I saw the musicality and the joy and the silliness and
you could hear it in the music.
Everything was there. And I just thought, my God, this is amazing. And I looked around the room. There wasn't one other A&R person from any label there. I knew them all, but no one was there.
So you were in on the secret. You struck gold, at least in your own head.
I guess in my own head, either that or everyone else deemed it too offbeat for them to be bothered with.
Well, I want to ask about something you just said when you talked about, earlier you talked about being a fan. Do you ever have that conflict within you that as an A&R person, Phish or otherwise, where you have to kind of sell and be a cheerleader? You have to kind of sell this band to your business side, the record company, but you're also a cheerleader for the band. Do you ever internally sense any friction, whether it's Phish or any other band?
The only friction that ever happens is when the executives above you, the people in charge, accuse you of being on the band side instead of on the label side.
Is there truth to that, though?
Yeah, there's always truth to that. Like I said before, I mean, if you do this job, you have to have a creative heart and you have to have a wide acceptance of creative people and you have to have a desire to help them. Like I call myself a patron of the arts, whether it's music or if I'm buying a painting of a friend of mine that I think is talented, you have to feel that. And a lot of times in the labels, it's a business, right? They're not thinking of it. And it's not their job to think of it. That's my job.
Right.
So I got it, of course, but it's annoying nevertheless. But,
there's a recurring motif in Phish's history as a band that they do things their way on their own time, how and when they want to do it, period.
Yeah.
And this included signing with a major label. Famously, Phish was hesitant to sign with Elektra. I think the popular image of most bands, at least when I was growing up, is, man, we got to sign with the label. We got to go to the showcase tonight. We got to give our best stuff. There's going to be record execs in the audience. What to you made Phish different? That they were, like you said, they weren't like angry about it, but they were, I think, kind of apathetic based on what I've read. They kind of just didn't care. They shrugged their shoulders at recording for a major label.
They didn't care because they didn't need what a label had to offer, really. Most people want to sign to a label so that they can get on the radio or they can get tour support, money to help them tour around the country. And Phish didn't need that. They were doing it themselves. So their there wasn't a big impetus to sign to a label. It just didn't really fit into their vision. But I think ultimately, when they realized that I certainly wasn't going to try and change them or morph them into something they weren't, and the label was going to be supportive, even though the label did try, oh, please, will you do an interview with Rolling Stone? Please, will you go on late night television? Please, can we work a single at rock radio? And it was no.
Yeah, they were up against the brick wall on that.
But we loved that because, that's refreshing. When do you ever see that? Most people are craving for attention and success. And these guys just had confidence. And honestly, I really think that it's who they are as people. They come from solid families, that they're just solid people. They're not lacking. Whereas a lot of people that go into music or theater, there's a hole they're trying to fill.
Yeah.
And Fish doesn't have that. None of them do.
But yet they're still artists.
And yet they're still artists, which makes them so special, so rare. But it was not easy to sign them. I had many conversations with their manager at the time, who was a very intelligent young guy. And
is it John Paluska?
John Paluska, yep. He was, really trying to understand where I was coming from, why would I even want to do this, and what would it do for the band? But the biggest thing it would do for the band, honestly, looking back, is distribution. Obviously, they had their tapers in the taping section and everyone was sharing music. But when you're on a major label with major distribution, your music gets into every store.
Find it at Sam Goody. Yeah.
Right away. So they made a very, I'm not going to say it's modest because I don't remember the numbers at all, but a very smart deal with us where they didn't ask for a ton of money. It was just a reasonable amount of money because, as John said to me, we want to be in the black right away. We don't want to be beholden to anybody. And from the day that first record shipped, A Picture of Nectar, and we took on the back catalog, but from the day Nectar shipped, they were in the black.
Well, I remember reading in one of their biographies that their lawyer looked over the contract, and there was a phrase in there. I don't know if you know where I'm getting to with this, but there was a phrase in there that said whatever album they recorded for Elektra had to be commercially sufficient. And their lawyers had crossed that out. We're going to make it technically proficient. So as far as they were concerned, it just needed to be recorded well. It didn't have to hit any sales numbers, or they wouldn't have to listen to any notes from the record company side.
That's funny. I in a way, that's kind of what commercially accepted means, but yeah.
Well, I mean, that's how they interpreted it, at least.
Yeah, that's true.
And you've been involved in signing They Might Be Giants, is that right? And Bare Naked Ladies too, right?
Yes, I did not sign the Bare Naked Ladies, but I became their A&R person, and I A&R'd their record that did very well, and they had a #1 single. And
right. Yeah. And so you have a knack, it seems, when you brought it up earlier, that you like to find bands that have a vision already established. And then you kind of like to share it with, not your words, but paraphrased, like share it with everyone. And is that part of what you looked for in A&R?
Oh, for me, always. I was always turned off when young artists would come and sit in my office and we'd be chatting and, I'd say, well, tell me about yourself or your music. Well, what do you want me to be? What should I do? And I thought to myself, oh my goodness, don't ask me what you should do. You should be knowing what you should do. So I was always turned off by that. And I always regarded people that had a vision. That's the only word. And I didn't care what genre it was in. When I signed Michelle Shock, she was very unique, very different. I'd never seen anyone like her. But she could be branded as a folky singer-songwriter, right? And then all these people started sending me demo tapes of folky singer-songwriters. And I'm sitting here going, I don't really love folky singer-songwriters. I just liked her. I thought she
Yeah,
was
yeah.
really talented. And then when they Might Be Giants, when I signed them, it was like I got all these nerdy, geeky pop bands and alternative bands. And I'm like, it's not that that's what I like. I just thought they were really good. And then when I signed Fish, it was the same thing. Every jam band from the Weeds came in. And I'm like, it's not that I love jam bands. I just thought Fish was really great. So it was kind of, yeah, you have to know who you are and be the best at what you're doing. And then that's interesting to me.
Well, and in the early 90s, it was a buyer's market for jam bands. I mean, this is at the time of the Horde Festival, and college radio and alt rock were becoming very popular and accessible. And there were a lot of jam bands that were breaking through with big hit singles. The easiest ones off the top of my head would be Blues Traveler and the Spin Doctors. I think we're both in 1992 to 1994 in that general area. And within a year or two of that, Dave Matthews Band became maybe the biggest band of the 90s. So Blues Traveler, who we're going to talk about during the show today, as John Popper makes an appearance, I wonder what made them different than Fish. Like, what were they able to crack a hit single? Was it just that Fish wasn't trying to do that it wasn't in their purview?
I think that is what it is, to be honest with you. Fish, those guys are talented enough to write a song that would have gone on the radio. I mean, Tweezer, we worked at rock radio. That's a rock radio song. They could do it. I don't think they wanted to do it because I think they understood what it meant. And look what it did mean. Spin Doctors, Blues Traveler. It's like, where are they?
Yeah.
They had those hit singles and then they just kind of dissipated.
Right. And it should be noted, I think, and you'll speak to this, I hope, for people who are newer fans. And to my own credit, I was probably 8 years old when the show was played, the Marquee show we're talking about today. I think it needs to be explained how popular Blues Traveler was within the mini realm of jam bands in that scene that you were describing when you showed up at the Marquee. Blues Traveler might have been the most successful. Like John Popper was at that time. Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. At that time, my memory might be foggy, but I'm not sure they got signed to a major label before I signed Fish to Elektra, though. They might have been signed later. Same with Spin Doctors. I think they got signed later, but they had more desire, or else they just wrote those songs that the label went, yeah, we're going to work this. Yeah. And the artist said, okay, work it. Whereas Fish wouldn't have ever said that.
Yeah, those were Columbia House artists, as I would call them, like Spin Doctors and Blues Traveler, where those 10 CDs for a penny, they were the ones that had the big quarter-page ads for those albums, for Four and Pocketful of Kryptonite.
Yep.
One last thing I want to ask you about before we get into Fish in the early 90s, in 1990, I sent you in our notes leading up to this a video that was produced by Elektra in, I think, 1991 or maybe 1992 that was made to promote Rift. And in it, you could see how the band is so uncomfortable being on camera to describe the concept of Rift, that it's a concept album of a man sleeping and each song represents a different dream over a night's course of sleep. Trey starts to use the metaphor of it's like a soup. And with a picture of nectar, we threw everything in and it was a big mishmash of soup. And then Fishman jumps in kind of to make fun of Trey, but subtly, and say, yeah, this is only one flavor of soup now. And before you know it, they're all just stringing along this joke when they're supposed to be taking it seriously. And at the same time, Elektra included concert footage of the weirdest parts of the band's shows. Fishman playing the bagpipes and the vacuum, and a lot of footage of fans dancing and smiling. And just the contrast between those two things, how comfortable the band is with being weird on stage without how uncomfortable they are being normal off stage. I didn't have any question to follow up. I just thought it was so goofy.
Yeah, it was. And I remember that. And you could see people's uncomfortableness. But to be fair, most everyone is uncomfortable in those situations when they're self-promoting or the label says we're going to do an electronic press kit or we're going to do a little piece and we want you to tell. It's uncomfortable, especially for genuine artists who just really want to speak through their music. But it is part of the sausage factory, shall we say.
Yeah.
And they did very little in that.
They still do. They still do very little.
Right. Well, yeah, but they're not on a major label any longer. But they did,
and they're not 19 any longer.
Yeah, but they did it with good humor, and they were never bitter about anything. It was just kind of like, oh, come on, we don't want to do that. That's not who we are, And really, John Paluska was the front of it all, dealing with him. We never went directly to the guys around John's back and said, yeah, we want you to do
of
that.
course.
It was just funny, though, because it was, but you got to love that. It's like they had their own scene, their own world, and that stuff wasn't important.
When was this show played?
So let's talk a little bit about 1990 as far as Phish goes and maybe the music scene at large as you saw it. So 1990 for Phish was a year of extreme growth for them musically and also touring. They were making that jump from just playing regular Main Street college bars to playing proper music venues that had reputations. Before 1990, they were playing those Main Street bars. And toward the end of 1990, they started outgrowing that circuit. And they were just hammering these venues over and over again, mostly in the Northeast, playing 3 or 4 times a year so that the person who saw them in January at this venue after the Phish left might bring 2 friends in March and then bring 5 friends in December when they came back. And that's certainly what happened for today's show that we're going to talk about in the Marquee. But I just looked over their touring schedule in 1990. They would play anywhere. I looked in March of 1990. They played in the basement of a frat house in Ohio for an intramural hockey team. If it paid, they were there. So they weren't totally outgrowing everything, but there were certain spots where they were certainly showing growth.
Yeah, I think they looked at touring and performing it was very siloed. In the Northeast, where they had developed a following, they knew what they were worth. But if they went further west, they knew that they had to start, pretty much from scratch to develop an audience there. Other than, I think, Colorado, where they made a trip early on in their career. And
they did again in 1990 also, to tell you right, yeah.
Yeah. So I think they were smart about that. But however, I saw them at the Marquee show and it was packed. But then I went to the Chance in Poughkeepsie, which is a little club, and there were maybe 30 people in the club. It wasn't packed at all. And, but they were nonetheless excited to see them, but it wasn't crowded. So I think they had to just keep developing each club, each region, each area according to where they were audience-wise. And they were humble about that. It's not like they thought, oh, gee, we can sell out New York City, so we're going to sell out Columbus, Ohio or something. No.
Right. And can you tell us a little bit about the Marquee? Because from what I could find, again, which was not much, is that it was all the way west. Yeah. All the way west in Manhattan, maybe the western edge of Chelsea, even if you're being generous as a realtor, to tell someone, oh, this is in Chelsea. What I found is that it was on West 21st Street between 10th and 11th Avenue. Is that the Marquee?
That is exactly where it was. That's exactly right.
Right. And like these days, if I go to a show at the High Line, I'm like, oh man, how am I going to get there? It's going to be, from Penn Station, that's like a 25-minute walk. And this is even farther west than that.
Yeah. This is further west, and certainly at that time in New York, it was the Wild West. There. It wasn't a populated area as it is today. Now
there's a reason that just north of it is called Hell's Kitchen. Like there's a reason for that nickname,
Right. Yeah. So I had never been to the Marquee before that gig either. It wasn't really a on my circuit of venues that I went to nightly or whatever. But, and I don't know if I ever went after that, actually.
Well, it went out of business after you mentioned it was short-lived. I think it was
Yeah.
only there for about 2 years, and then it turned, I think, into either a gay club or a dance club, or maybe a gay dance club. I don't know. And then like a
Yeah.
Spanish flamenco club, and it changed hands a million times. And I'm sure now it's an art gallery or something.
Oh yeah, has to be. I'm going to go buy it this week.
Yeah.
So yeah, that was the Marquee. That was, that was, like I said, an unusual club at the time in New York, not a regular place to play. But Fish was known for that. They would produce their own shows a lot of times. Paluska would rent out, what's the place in Paradise in Boston?
In Boston,
Is that what
yeah.
it's called?
Yep.
Yeah,
Paradise
and
Rock Club.
they would promote their own show there. They weren't part of the Paradise booking situation. They would just tell the Paradise, we want to rent your show. We want to rent your venue. And then they would do everything, including bring in their own security for the show.
Yeah, well, Mike Gordon tells a story that exactly about the Paradise, that they couldn't get booked. Paluska would send their press and never get a phone call back, tapes and everything. And then, yeah, they just decided to rent it out. They bussed people from Vermont, from Burlington. They had two big buses, coach buses. They bring everyone down. And as the band was loading in with their, broken amps and their weird gear, and they were wearing their flannel shirts that didn't look like a professional band, the bouncers were making fun of them. Who are these guys? And then they sold out the first night to the point where they didn't need to rent it out the second time.
That's exactly right. They were very smart about that. And then they promoted all of their own festivals and stuff later on. But yeah, they were the first band to really do something like that.
And it got to a point in 1998 where they were recording the Story of the Ghost album, and they wanted to play a couple shows just on a whim. So they played the Island tour, which were 2 shows in Long Island at the Nassau Coliseum and 2 shows in Rhode Island at what I think the Providence Civic Center or the Dunkin' Donuts Center. And I remember it being such a huge deal at the time. They didn't buy any advertising anywhere. They only announced it on their website. And this is 1998. It's hard to remember sometimes how ubiquitous pop-up ads are now, but to just announce something on a website, the Coliseum is like 16,500 people.
It's amazing. And speaking of websites, they were the first artists that I had worked with who had their own website. It was before we had email at Elektra. We weren't connected in any way, electronically speaking. And they had their own website. And I kept thinking, God, wonder what that is, or what does it look like, or how do you even get to this website? It was just so foreign to me. Like, I didn't get it.
Through Prodigy and AOL, obviously. Yeah. That's through your internet service provider.
Right, which nobody had.
And just one note of 1990, back to what you said earlier about distribution. In 1990, they released their album Lawn Boy, which had a big issue with distribution. They hired a company called Absolute A-Go-Go Records that pressed, I think it was, I could be wrong on this number, but 10,000 copies. And then Absolute A-Go-Go went bust before they could release it. So Mike Gordon, the bass player, has said several times that that's one big reason why they weren't so excited to sign with a label. Because look, they tried and look what happened. As if they were on the receiving end of a divorce. Like, my first marriage went like this, so I'm never getting married again.
Yeah, I understand that, but I don't think if they were really thinking about it, you cannot put an indie distributor against the Warner Electro Atlantic distribution. So I think the distribution worked out fine for them.
And the Marquee, one last question I have for you about it. It was their next venue up after the Wetlands. They'd kind of outgrown it. And I had been to the Wetlands a few times before it closed. The capacity was 500, and that's elbow to elbow. That's if they really, really pushed it. I couldn't find any photos or video of the Marquee, because any video I did find just focused on the band who was on stage. I think it was the video I found was the Lunatics and the Rollins and the Rollins band, but nothing showed the audience. Are you able to remember anything about what it was like being inside the Marquee, or how big it was, anything physically?
Yeah, I can see the venue in my mind's eye perfectly, but I think it was about 1,000 capacity.
Oh, wow.
If I'm not mistaken. Yeah. but it was a large stage and sort of I'm remembering it as sort of a half moon kind of a room where the crowd it was more wide than deep. But yeah, I think it was close to 1,000 people, if I'm not wrong.
That's, it's funny because I looked up contemporaries, like who else played a venue like the Marquee in 1990. The list that I found was Blues Traveler, of course, the Spin Doctors, of course, but the Black Crowes also, who were starting to explode at that time. The Rollins Band I mentioned, Debbie Harry played it solo, Yola Tango, the Mighty Mighty Boss Tones, Pantera, the Screaming Trees, Bob Mould. So Fish was not, they weren't at the bottom row anymore. They were in very good company.
Oh, totally. These were all established artists at that time. Yeah, it wasn't small, that's for sure. I'm sure it was about 1,000.
Set 1.
So let's get into the show itself. The first song that they kicked off with was Runaway Jim, which was new that year, but has since become a classic. It sounded like everything was at kind of a higher pitch and a higher frequency than what we're used to today. And you could tell they're practiced, but they weren't quite as eloquent as we're used to now when they're playing Madison Square Garden sold out 4 nights. They're still prone to a couple little mistakes. Did you notice, since this was your first show seeing them live, how quickly did the musicality grab you, like their expertise on their instruments?
Yeah, the musicality grabbed me immediately. That was the first thing that I was attracted to, but it's funny, you sent me the set list and I listened to it and I had those exact same thoughts. I'm like, oh my gosh, this is watching a baby Fish.
Yeah.
Like it's almost like it's studied and they're really working hard to do the right thing and to play the right musically, it's just deliberate. It's not like it is now where it's just second nature to them, but it was really sweet to listen to that, those early days. But yeah, musically, I was blown away straight away because, well, first of all, the music was different from most of the stuff I was listening to or going to see. But secondly, the way they interacted with each other, you could just see there was a musical conversation going on constantly, even in those days. And it's true. And when I went to Vermont, I'll just sidebar.
Sure.
They told me about all the musical games they played in rehearsal. And it all made sense, when you see them live, like, geez, these guys are, musically, they know each other perfectly well. Like there's nothing they don't know or can't follow or can't keep up or can't trace back or do whatever. But anyway, so yeah, the musicality was the first thing. And then the songs were so catchy. I have to admit, maybe it's because that was my first show, or maybe it's because, I did a lot of Fish in those days and I do a lot less now, but these are my favorite songs of theirs. Yeah. And they always will be. It's like Divided Sky is probably one of my favorite songs. I just love it. I used to listen to it in my office nonstop. I'm sure the rest of the staff would be like, what is she doing?
Well, too bad for them.
Yeah, exactly.
And so speaking of musicality, the next song is Foam, which is, I think Trey has even called it one of the most difficult songs that they play. And this is really hard. You could hear it. And I was trying to listen to it through your ears, through an A&R person's ears. But my thought is, what kind of audience comes out to see a band that plays music like this? It's just so weird, and it's almost like they're still in the practice room making sure they're getting it right. It's very earnest.
It is very earnest. But to your point, I think that was the third thing that grabbed me. The first was the musicality. Second was the songs, the melodies, and the funny lyrics or wry lyrics. But the third thing was, wow, people are really responding to this music. Like, these people love this music and they clearly know it. And that was so impressive to me. And as an A&R person who's got two hats on, the talent scout and the business person, to me, that just made total sense. Like, this makes sense to me. Here's a whole segment of people listening to this music.
And it clicks really in two songs later. They played Horn, where Trey introduces Tom Marshall, who is in attendance, talking about songwriters, right? And then next up was Reba, which immediately gets a really big cheer. At the time, it had only been around for just over a year, 14 months. And for all intents and purposes, it's the same song it is today, but the crowd responds immediately, like they already have their favorites. And I thought that was an interesting thing to hear, that as early as this is in the band's career, right? Page joined in 1986. So they've only been together really in their lineup for 4 years at this point, but the fans have already chosen their favorites.
Yeah. Oh yeah, for sure. But the next one is one of my favorites, Llama.
What about
I like the really punchy, rocky, like thing. Yeah, those are my favorites. Well, other than Divided Sky.
But it's one of my favorites too, because I got into Fish by listening to A Picture of Nectar, and Llama kicks off that album. So to me, it's like the best rocker that they have. And they then go really weird with Colonel Forbin's Ascent and Fly Famous Mockingbird. Yeah. And I was wondering about your look in this, that how could someone in A&R justify or explain something like this to a record label? Yeah, there's this band with this internal fairy tale that some people in the audience get, most probably don't. And it has all these weird names that the lead guitarist wrote as his college thesis. I want you to sign them.
Yeah. Well, I'm not going to lie, because I think that there were certain moments, and that's one of them, where I was totally lost. Like, what is this? What is going on? I only understood it later when Trey would explain sometimes to the audience or whatever. But at that show, I had no clue. But again, I just thought, okay, at that time, how old would I have been? And 90. I was 29 or something. I'm older than most of the people in this audience. So maybe.
How old was the audience? What did the audience look like?
I think they were like college kids, like 21 and 2. I don't know if it was a 21 and older club. I can't remember that, but they were in their early 20s, I would say. Maybe if it was younger, 18 and older club, then they would have been that. But I was older, so I'm thinking, well, maybe this is just something I'm not getting because I'm 29. But anyway, yeah, it was odd, but that was endearing to me too, because it's like, well, they have the guts to go and play these songs that are just fantastical and not really, verse, chorus, bridge, chorus. It was just like, whoa, they're just creative.
Right. And it's not enough for it to be entertaining and fun to listen to, it has to be challenging also. It has to challenge both the band and the listener.
Yes, exactly. And I learned all of this as I saw more shows and as I got to know them. And but the first time it was just kind of this, bang, it hit me in the face like, whoa, this is something completely different. I was attracted to it, but it was different.
I love hearing you say this because I still see them regularly. I have a couple shows in Atlantic City coming up in a couple of weeks, and fingers crossed that indoor venues will be all right around New Year's Eve, that I can go see them at Madison Square Garden again. But every time I go, there's always someone around me that it's their first show. And they say the same exact things that you're saying right now.
Yeah.
It's where they need something explained to them, or, they talk how Divided Sky is my favorite song. It really is. It's heartening. It really is. It's really wonderful.
I was going to say, and the thing that's so amazing is that, 30 years down, it still sounds unique. No one else sounds like this. So that's why people are still going, well, what is this? So yeah, it's amazing.
And after Forbins and Mockingbird, they play another another suite that's been constant and consistent throughout their whole career. They played it the other night, Mike's Hydrogen Weekapog. Mm-hmm. And this is just, you need a shot of adrenaline. If you didn't like them yet, this would do it for you, right?
Yeah, I love it. Weekapog is one of my favorites too. I just love it. I always like Mike's song, always.
And to close it all out is from Junta, Golgi Apparatus, which is always an incredible closer. It's, in my opinion, the most versatile Phish song. It can be played anywhere in a show. It's one of their earliest songs. Trey wrote it with Tom Marshall when they were like high school kids and they learned about songs in science class. They learned about terms in science class, and they turned it into this that they played, I think, this past Saturday in Alpharetta, Georgia.
Amazing.
So did you see a lot of bands with a two-set structure?
No. At that time, if you were a young band but like I said, most of the bands I went to see were probably aspiring to be signed to a label. You wouldn't play two sets. You would play one killer short set and be done. But no, I when they said we'll be back or whatever, I was like, what? I thought, my God, they're coming back. And also, honestly, as an A&R person or a record music executive in general, you see so much music night after night after night, and it becomes your job, right? There's enjoyment in it, but it is a job. And to think that, oh no, you mean I have to stay here longer? I thought I'd be home by now. But in this case, it was totally worth it and exciting to stay.
Set 2.
So they opened the second set with The Landlady, which was played at almost every show in 1990 and 1991 before it was shelved, I think after 94, for 15 years as a standalone song. And this was kind of the band you mentioned before about genre. They were kind of showing that they're stretching themselves, that they could play Latin rock just as well as progressive rock, just as well as hard rock with Llama and stuff like that. So this is a pretty ballsy opener to open a second set with.
Totally. I mean, that is really like, I mean, you could almost lose your audience playing something like that.
Especially at the beginning of a second set. Right.
Yeah,
People are going, I've already
exactly.
waited. I've already set out the break. And this is what they're going to open with. Let's get out of here.
Yeah, no, but you're right. It shows their chops, and it shows they're students of music, and they love all genres. I mean, they really do, and they can play them all beyond proficiently. They're experts.
Yeah, to the point where Trey is co-writing a Broadway musical in 2010. Hands
Which
on a
I
Heart
went to
Body.
see. I know I went to see it, and I in La Jolla when it debuted. Amazing.
Yeah, he's not just him, but the whole band. They're
Oh yeah.
they're music omnivores.
Yes. Yeah, they are.
And they followed it up with Possum, which is very straightforward Southern blues, kind of Lynyrd Skynyrd type. If you like that, you'll like this. And at the end, they played We Wish You a Merry Christmas, tease. Let's not forget. The show is December 28th, right? So happy holidays from Trey.
Yeah. I heard that. I hadn't remembered they'd done that, but that was fun to listen to.
And they followed that up with The Squirming Coil and Tweezer, which were two big songs at the time. I'd have grown to be, I keep using this phrase, fan favorites, but you said that these are your favorite batch of songs. Now they're known as a jam band, but there's not a lot of improvisation in this. This is very song focused.
It's song focused. And I think that is because I think that's because it was earlier in their career and they were just getting the songs written and being able to perform them. I mentioned, this is just a funny aside, to my daughter that I was doing this podcast, and she's like, oh my gosh, she's like, all those jams. And I said, no, actually this set doesn't have a lot of jams.
Yeah.
It's just the songs, because it was early on, really.
And even without a lot of extended improv, the end of The Squirming Coil did have a pretty cool jam. Usually it's a piano outro, but this time the whole band steps in, which is one of the best versions I've ever heard. Tweezer comes in, which again, it's not fully baked yet, but they did segue into Manteca, which also appeared on A Picture of Nectar. And goes back into Tweezer, which had that old school ending where they kind of dribble and fall apart at the end very, very slowly.
Yeah. Oh, God.
And then again, stretching their musical talents and their abilities with genre, they played the Okipa Ceremony, which got a big cheer, and then she played My Sweet One, which was a bluegrass song.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I remember when I first saw them do an a cappella barbershop quartet. And I was like, there's nothing these guys can't do.
Do you remember when that was, or even what song?
It was in the early 90s. And it was Sweet Adeline, I'm pretty sure. But I don't remember where it was. Where was that? I don't remember. Oh, it might have been at the Roseland.
Oh, well, that's probably 1992.
Yeah.
That would make sense, because I remember reading that they started doing that. I think Paige explained it. I could be wrong on that detail, but they looked at each other and they started playing small theaters at that time in the early 90s, like the Colonial Theater in New Hampshire. And they said, well, these theaters were built for unmiked music.
Yeah.
So why don't we learn how to do that? And after all, we are a quartet.
That's right. It might have been at the Capitol Theater in
Portchester.
Portchester. Yeah. Actually, the first time.
And then after that was your favorite, was Divided Sky.
My very favorite. Yeah. I just love that song. I love everything about it.
So it must have been so impressive to hear them play this epic live, especially to someone like you who hadn't heard it before.
Yeah, I had heard the album, I think, by this time.
Okay.
But I hadn't heard it live ever.
So you saw them on the cover of CMJ.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah. So you saw Lawn Boy.
And then I went back and got Junta. Yeah. So I had both records before I saw them. Yeah.
Got it. And my comment in our notes at the end of Divided Sky was, how could anyone not like this? But the amount of shit I've gotten for being a big Fish fan, there are ways that people could not like this.
I guess. Maybe my colleagues back in the day don't like it because they heard it so much coming out of my office.
Well, again, their loss.
Yeah.
And after that, they brought up John Popper as a guest, who was the bigger star, at least among the jam band community at the time. And they played a song called No Good Trying, which is a Syd Barrett song, which if Fish wasn't weird enough yet, let's get the strangest member of Pink Floyd, which is saying a lot in itself, and cover a song by him.
And I remember when they announced that they were going to play that, and I thought, oh my God, these guys are really, they're just in their own lane.
Yeah, for a band that was very, as we discussed before, uncomfortable talking about their own album or promoting it, they were very much feeling themselves on stage.
But they still didn't talk a lot.
No, and they rarely do still.
They've never really talked, yeah.
And so John Popper comes on. Trey, I imagine, was on the drums, right? Do you remember?
Yes, I think so at this point, because Fish was up front, right?
Yep. So Trey gets on. John Popper plays a harmonica solo between No Good Trying and then Hold Your Head Up. They switch back and they play a song that's only been played thrice in all of Fish's history, called Don't Get Me Wrong, which I did a little research, was co-written between Trey and John Popper. It's basically a blues riff.
Yeah.
With John Popper taking lead vocals. Do you remember what it was like to see, first of all, Fish as four virtuosos, but John Popper, who is incomparable on the harmonica?
Yeah. He is, and he was quite a presence. And I remember I guess I was first surprised, like, oh my God, there's John Popper coming up to join them. And I think I also was a little surprised at how fraternal they were, how close they were, when I didn't really know the relationship between them. And I mean, he's amazing. We used to kind of tease and joke about him, me and my colleagues, not Fish, because it's just like, oh my goodness, how many notes can you play?
Yeah, no kidding.
But anyway, he is astounding. So that was exciting to see that. And it, brought a little celebrity stardust to the show.
Well, it's funny you said how many notes can you play? Between John Popper and Trey, that's
Yeah,
that's enough to last you a decade.
it is.
And then they close it all up, at least for the set, before the encore with Funky Bitch, a cover of a Sun Seals blues song, which Mike, I was wondering what was up with this. It sounded like he was trying to play like an old blues soul man. And I love Mike Gordon, and he's comfortable where he's comfortable singing, but man, this was a weird take on Funky Bitch.
Yeah. Yeah, I thought that was really odd. I don't remember it from that night.
Yeah.
But listening the other day to it, I was like, oh, okay.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
We'll
All right.
leave it there. Who are we to
Yeah.
tell them?
Yeah, yeah.
And for the encore, two really accessible, fun songs, Bouncing Around the Room and Highway to Hell.
Yeah, yeah. I remember that. I mean, I love Bouncing Around the Room too. It is also a favorite, but I remember them ending on Highway to Hell. And I thought, this is just amazing. Like, there they are, just going for it, rock and roll.
And how long after this did you approach them on Elektra's behalf?
That night.
Wow, really?
I found them backstage that night. Yes. And I told them who I was. I'm sure I gave them my card like a total geeky record executive. And yeah, I mean, they were polite, and I don't know what they thought, but I was like, I must continue down this road and get to know these guys. So yeah, it was that night.
And to wrap it up, about how long did you work with them before you moved on from Elektra? So
it was, unfortunately, they were the last band that I signed to Elektra. I signed them in 91, and we did Nectar, a picture of Nectar, and then started Rift and went through that process of hiring the producer, et cetera. And then I left in 92, but I continued to sort of oversee the making of that record.
And do you still see Fish at all?
Oh, I do. I went to the Hollywood Bowl right before the pandemic. I took my husband. His screensaver on his phone is the lights from the Hollywood Bowl, and I saw Trey and Paige after sound check. I hung out with them for a minute, and like I said, I saw Trey, of course, do Hands on a Hard Body. But yeah, I will always go see them and stay in touch. And I look forward to seeing, if I had been in New York, I would have loved to have gone to the Baker's Dozen. But if, next time they play in LA or here, I will definitely go.
Fan for life, huh?
Oh, yeah. Fan and friend, for sure.
Sue Drew of Cobalt Music, I can't thank you enough. And I want to tell you on a personal level, knowing that you worked with them on A Picture of Nectar, that was the album that grabbed me. So we literally would not be here if it weren't for you. Even though it's my podcast, you made it happen. It's
they made
real
it
cyclical
happen.
here.
Yeah,
that's true.
But it's all them. And Brian, it was my pleasure, a real joy. Thank you for inviting me on.
And that's it for today's interview with Sue Drew of Cobalt Music Publishing. Now, when Sue picked a show from late 1990, so many years ago, it only makes sense that there would be some discussion points that either need to be corrected or expanded upon. With that in mind, it is now time for the Attendance Bias Fact Check.
Attendance Bias Fact Check.
First off, the Elektra promo video that the band used when they released Rift, and they used the soup analogy that Sue and I discussed in detail, is available in today's show notes. And just as a general fact check, or reference, I guess, many of the references and paraphrases that I brought up in today's interview, such as Fish's lawyer changing the language in their contract with Elektra, are from a variety of published sources. However, I've been reading and researching so much about Fish for so many decades that I had to rely on my memory and my quick recall, so I wasn't able to track down every quote and every fact to its original source. So I'm just going to do a big umbrella sourcing for all of these different books and sources that I've used. So that said, I have to give a lot of credit to the Fish Compendium by Dean Budnick, the Fish Book, compiled and edited by Richard Gere, the Fish Biography by Park Peterberg, Fish.net, and of course Fishbase, the organization and publication that originally interviewed Sue. Fishbase first published their interview with Sue in 2017, and the link to that interview is in today's show notes. When discussing Fish's commercial success in terms of album sales, Sue is quick to point out that a live one went gold upon its release. Since the mid-90s, Fish has had a very strong sales record, as Junta has gone platinum, and Lawn Boy, A Picture of Nectar, Rift, Hoist, Billy Breathes, and Farmhouse have all gone gold. I brought up Blues Traveler and the Spin Doctors breaking through with hit records in the early 90s, but I couldn't exactly pin down when each of their albums came out. So a fact check on that. The Spin Doctors' Pocketful of Kryptonite was released in August 1991 with the singles Little Miss Can't Be Wrong peaking at number 17 on the US charts in 1992 and Two Princes peaking at number 7 on the US charts in 1993. For Blues Traveler, their hit album, 4, was released on September 13th, 1994. It sold over 6 million copies, and the singles Hook peaked at number 23, and Runaround peaked at number 8 on the Billboard charts. I brought up that in 1990, Fish played at a fraternity house to celebrate an intramural hockey team in Ohio. This show was played on March 28, 1990 at Denison University in Granville, Ohio. The show is available on Fish.in as a soundboard recording, and interestingly, it features the debuts of Tweezer and Runaway Jim, tied off with a rare whipping post encore. When talking about Fish's touring schedule in 1990, I erroneously said that the band played Telluride in 1990. The band did play several gigs in Colorado that year, including shows in Crested Butte, Boulder, Fort Collins, and Colorado Springs, but none in Telluride. Sue remembers seeing Fish sing Sweet Adeline at the Roseland Ballroom, but she couldn't pin down exactly when it was. I suggested that maybe it was in 1992. I was wrong, however. Even though Fish played Roseland in 1992, they did not perform Sweet Adeline at that show. Upon further research, they did perform Sweet Adeline at Roseland on February 6, 1993, and then later she suggests that maybe she heard Sweet Adeline at the Capitol Theater in Port Chester. If that's the case, then it had to be on April 27, 1991. And that's it for today's episode of Attendance Bias. I would like to extend tremendous thanks to Sue Drew of Cobalt Music Publishing for offering her time and her generosity and, of course, her memories and her opinions to talk about it on the show. I'd like to thank all of you listeners for joining me every week. I'd like to thank Fish.net for helping me out so much with the fact check, as well as Fish.in, Fishin', for providing the soundboard recording used in today's episode. If you enjoy Attendance Bias, please subscribe and follow the podcast on whichever app that you choose. Leave a rating and a review. And find me on social media, mostly on Twitter and Instagram. Reach out, say hello, and I'll send you a free sticker. So again, thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you next week on Attendance Bias.